I'm Kim Masinki from Chiang Mai City Life, and I'm here today with Dave Mathieson, a dear friend of mine from many, many, many years, and he's also an expert in all things Burma. So we're here to talk about what's going on next door, because there's a lot going on right now, isn't there? So do you mind introducing yourself to our two viewers?
Sawadee Krap. My name is David Mathieson, and I've been working on Burma, Myanmar for about 25 years. Mostly based here in Thailand, but also in Yangon, Rangoon, Burma, Myanmar,
Yeah.
for several years before the pandemic hit and before the coup d'etat of February 2021. And it's great to be here. Thank you very much, Pim.
So you're an independent consultant now, right? So what do you do? What's your role? What's your interest in all this?
I used to be an academic researcher. And I spent a lot of time working on various issues on the border to do with human security, refugees, humanitarian assistance, the drug trade. And then for 10 years, I was the senior researcher on Burma, Myanmar for New York-based Human Rights Watch. And then I left about 4 or 5 years ago to become an independent analyst, which basically means I do a lot of different things. I write reports for various Western donors. I write articles, news analysis pieces for the Asia Times and other publications such as the Irrawaddy and some international newspapers as well. So it's kind of a mixed bag, but it's really about trying to understand the political and conflict dynamics of Burma, and that's become extraordinarily more difficult in these trying times.
Because you're a source for, I remember embassies would consult you, the United Nations would consult you. So, I mean, as a source, who are your sources? How do you get your information?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think working on the country for so long, you build up lots of networks of friends, of contacts. You try and invite as many different perspectives as you can. And so I try and listen to as many different people as I can to try and get a more balanced assessment of what's going on. It's not unlike being a journalist in many respects, that you've got to have this broad pool of contacts and trusted sources, and then trying to take into account as many different perspectives as you can, so that when you do speak to embassies or international organizations, you can put yourself out there as like, look, this is just my opinion, but from my work and my research, this is the way that I interpret the situation, whether you like it or not. And sometimes you reach very unpopular conclusions that people don't like, but I think need to be heard.
Yeah, because I remember, like, 10 years ago when I was going to Burma a lot and visiting you a lot, and what was that hotel lobby that you just lived in?
The Traders Hotel.
The Traders Hotel.
The lovely bar up in the Traders Hotel, which closed during the pandemic for a period, and really was this kind of bustling central point for a lot of journalists, researchers, lots of different people who were going in there because the internet was the best in town. And it wasn't
crucial
for another few years. And interestingly enough, once I started getting the internet in my apartment, and you could get it pretty much everywhere, I stopped going as much to the Traders Hotel. And I visited once, and some of the staff there said, "Where did everyone go?
Right?
And we've missed you. And can you please come back and work from here?" Because sometimes I would literally spend several hours. I think my record was 12 hours.
I'm not surprised. I remember visiting you at the Traders Hotel, and there'd just be a constant stream of people coming up and just discussing, like, everything Burma. It was really fascinating. So, which brings me to now, like, how long has it been since your last visit?
It's been nearly 2 years. I left in March 2020 because my daughter lives here in Chiang Mai, and because of the uncertainties around the pandemic, I didn't want to be stuck in Rangoon, so I came back here and tried to get back at various points, and the plan was to go back in January, February of 2021. And the coup d'etat, put a hold on that.
It must be hard to stay in touch now and keep abreast, is it? I mean, or you just rely on your old networks of people?
There's a lot of, and unfortunately, there's a lot of friends of mine who've had to flee the country because of security risks. Some who have stayed, so communicating with them is not impossible, but always security is paramount.
Yeah.
And then there's other people who are there in international organisations that can speak more openly. But it's reaching people in lots of conflict areas in which communications is terrible because there's multiple wars going on at the moment. So.
Right. I mean, I remember, sorry, I just read your interview with Irrawaddy, and you said that this is probably the most desperate time for Myanmar since the post-war independence. So, I mean, I remember the Saffron Revolution. I mean, you just remember one skirmish after another, one massacre after another, one revolution after another. So what makes this time in particular the most desperate? And what do you mean by the most desperate?
I think it's really, this coup d'etat didn't come as a surprise to a lot of Myanmar Burmese friends who could see the tension growing in the aftermath of the election in November 2020. But what it did do was just outrage so many people who thought that, imperfectly, but in a positive way, the country was heading in the right direction, even though there were lots of bad things still happening. For a lot of people in cities and in rural areas, they just voted for Aung San Suu Kyi to have a second term as a semi-democratic system leader. And she got overwhelming support, and other parties in areas like Shan State did very well. And that election victory really said two things about the country. One, it was a vote for her and her party, but it was also a resounding vote against the military coming back into power.
Yeah.
And the leader of the military, Min Aung Hlaing, decided, no, he wants raw power, and he just came and grabbed it.
And he didn't anticipate this when they opened it up to the vote?
I think he miscalculated.
He honestly thought it was popular.
He honestly thought that the people would give up eventually and just go, things will get back to some kind of semi-normalcy. And then what has transpired is that the military inevitably cracks down violently. They kill large numbers of people, 1,500 or so people have been killed by the military, probably a lot more. And what that has done is spread nationwide resistance in cities, in areas that have not seen violence in 70 years. And suddenly,
like what kind of what areas?
I mean, in the northwest, in some of these states and regions like Sagaing and Magway and small Chin State, you've got just average people, farmers and villagers who are taking up arms and killing Burmese army soldiers, raiding police stations because they're furious at the coup, but they're also furious at the brutality of the military when it comes and puts down this violence. And then you could kind of cast that as the new wars of the country. The old wars are ethnic armed organizations, call them rebels or insurgents, national liberation movements. They've been fighting for 70, 50 years. And so that they see this as just a new round in an old story.
Right.
And in some areas, we're seeing kind of new resistance fighters grafting onto older resistance fighters and creating new alliances and being trained by some of the best organized insurgent outfits in the world.
Such as?
The Karen National Liberation Army is the oldest non-state armed group in the world. The Kachin Independence Army is incredibly professional and has been fighting for 50 years or more. And some of the others, even smaller ones, who have a lot of skills. They've been doing armed resistance against the central state for many years. So they've got soldiers that really know how to ambush, how to train, how to do lots of different skills that a lot of these people from the cities don't know. They don't know how to grow up in the jungle.
No. But yet there's no cohesion. I mean, there's constant allies and breaking of allies. And I mean, where's it all going now? You say this is a new kind of war. So there's new groups coming up. Are there new alliances happening? I mean, how is this different, and how is it going to affect the country going forward?
I think it's almost impossible to predict what is going to happen because it is so dynamic.
Isn't that what you're supposed to do?
Well, I mean...
I need you to do that.
I mean, I think anyone who makes firm predictions is being foolish in a situation like this. You can identify trends. You can say, look, this is only going to get worse. I think that's fair to say, unfortunately. You can say, with certain amount of certainty, that there's no way that you can trust the Myanmar military. Absolutely no way. So
why do people keep negotiating with them?
Well, I think that, unfortunately, we've found that, especially internationally, the limits of international power, that that they can't think beyond issuing statements, trying to mediate, trying to send a special envoy, trying to do this, all of which hasn't worked. And so I think there's a lot of people who are flummoxed by, obviously the man in charge, Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, doesn't want to negotiate, so we don't really know how to deal with that. And then there's tired old talk of sanctions and isolation, all these things that didn't really work in the past. And I think it shows a really empty toolkit on the part of a lot of the United Nations, the Americans, unfortunately, who are being very, very good in applying pressure and trying to get, international allies to work together. And Thailand and the rest of the countries of Southeast Asia are getting more and more vexed about what's happening because they're not, getting any kind of assistance from Min Aung Hlaing or the Myanmar military to bolster their efforts. And so, unfortunately, the Myanmar people are on their own, really.
So, I mean, I remember sort of the great opening, like when was that, 2011, 12, when it was just so exciting. The whole world was coming in. It was flooded with NGOs and projects and government, everything. And why would the military put a kibosh on it? Because they weren't losing power, were they? I mean, I don't understand why it all went backwards so quickly.
I mean, it's really impossible to know because the justifications for the coup by the military are completely unconvincing. Right. And a lot of people before, fellow analysts and academics and many friends of mine were saying there's no way that there would be a coup because this would be against the military's interests. Right. I still think that's completely valid. So I think an important point is this coup works against their self-interest. Right. Economically, militarily, politically, socially, they're completely isolated, vilified. The whole country despises them right now. The economy's tanking. Their neighbours are furious at them. Basically, if you think of this as a smash and grab coup d'etat, where you're greedy and you just want to grab the whole pot for yourself, and you think, well, that pot's diminished, but still, I'll have most of it. It's like, no, that pot might actually, there's holes in it now. Right. And so, the idea of, if one analogy would be, if you're a parasite, which they are, you need a healthy host to actually stay healthy.
Exactly, yeah.
And unfortunately, they're making the entire country sick. So as parasites, they must be looking, and yet I think a certain part of their mentality is, I don't care if we broke it, because we just want to own it. So
they're the Delta variant rather than the Omicron.
You could potentially put them in that, but they're certainly not as contagious as Omicron.
I think you said somewhere that they basically declared war on the people, which just sounds absolutely insane to me, right?
Yeah. And the people see through all their flimsy justifications for the coup. They talked about 11 million irregular votes and that the election was stolen. And it's like people were like, well, actually, I remember voting and I didn't see any irregularities. And international and domestic observers said, few things wrong, but no election's perfect, but it reflected the will of the people. Yeah. And so the justifications that Suu Kyi was an election stealer, just completely unconvincing.
Right. Yeah. And because in the past there was sort of kind of the Burmans versus the ethnic groups, right? And it was always like, I don't know if I'm correct, but the Burmans seem to be a bit more taken care of. But so you're saying now it's across the board. Everyone is now against the military, including those in Rangoon. So what kind of resistance is there now in the city?
In the cities, what we're unfortunately seeing is a lot of resistance cells that have been trained on the borders and have come back, and they're perpetrating drive-by shootings.
In Yangon?
Yeah, there's bombs going off everywhere.
Oh.
Small bombs, but military trucks going up, attacks against police stations, against checkpoints, and a lot of killings in Burmese, you would call them dalan, an informer. And so people are watching and thinking, that person is informing on activities in a neighborhood, so someone will just go and shoot them.
And this is even like the normal average middle class working people. I mean, has that life been affected? The economic boom that we saw the last decade or so?
People are certainly feeling it economically now. And friends of mine say that in the past 4 or 5 months, things have gone back to normal, but then hasten to add, but it's not normal. You'll go and eat lunch, you'll meet your friends, and you'll see normalcy, and you'll turn a corner, and there will be this big checkpoint, soldiers pointing guns at you, and then you'll hear an explosion at night. And so people say it's very deceiving. And then you only have to go a short period outside of the cities, and there's airstrikes. Like there's military aircraft dropping bombs and thousands of troops moving at civilians. There's nothing normal about that at all.
No.
And this is happening in multiple parts around the country.
Where are they getting all the military? Where are they buying it from?
Mostly Russia.
Oh.
Russian attack helicopters, Russian jets. They got a lot of equipment from the Chinese over the past 30 years or so. The other thing is that the military has its own domestic defense industry. And so the rifles that it uses, the pistols, the uniforms, the bullets, all of these things, they're made in Myanmar.
Oh, they are?
And so prospects for an international arms embargo, while people should still try doing that, they basically domestically manufacture the tools of repression.
Right.
The things that kill protesters are mostly made in Myanmar, except for the heavy artillery and the helicopters and the jets.
Right. So tell me about the role of China. I mean, China is just looming there, right? So, I mean, I've also heard, though, that they've been talking to some of the minority groups as well, right? Not just so where's their relationship right now with the military and with the rest of the country?
I think it's important to realize that before the pandemic descended, Xi Jinping traveled to Burma and signed 33 MOUs for big Belt and Road infrastructure initiatives. And then, of course, the inevitable pandemic slowdown. But they want to get to the Indian Ocean, and the Chinese want access to raw materials, and strategically they want to open up.
Well, they've already had access to the whole Gashin jade trade and all that up there,
Certainly.
and the teak and the...
Yeah, but Chinese capitalism is rapacious. They want it all.
Yes, it is.
And so they must be feeling quite a deal frustrated that those plans for their plans are now on hold because the military staged the coup. And it's not in their interest to publicly condemn or take a side, but it's evident that they don't want to see this kind of instability. A war, where they've got economic gains to be made is not in their interest.
Right. But why isn't the military playing ball with them? Surely there's a lot of money to come from China. I mean, that's just cash right there.
I think the military are playing hard to get. It's like, look, eventually you'll just come to us and we'll get a better deal because, we understand your greed, we understand your interests, and we'll just wait for you to come and play ball. That was their calculation for many years. And I think the Chinese are concerned that they're going to have to make those kind of deals. They're also concerned about the way that they're perceived within Burma. That if they're perceived to be too close to the military and endorsing this coup, there could be a backlash against their interests, against ethnic Chinese people. And so they're really trying to play all sides now, which they always have.
Yeah.
But they've got to play a very delicate balancing act here. And to me, it's kind of like, what they're doing is not interfering at some of the northern-based groups, the ethnic armed organizations. Like you can go off and fight. We'll just let it happen until we can show a bit of influence and ask you to pull it back, and then we'll speak to the military. I think to them there's still a lot of uncertainty about where this coup is going to go.
Right. I mean, you say it like it's a present tense, this coup is going to go. So you still feel like we're in the coup now? I mean, it's been...
There's a lot of people who call it the attempted coup. There's a lot of people who call it the failed coup. To me, the fact that so many parts of the country have not gone back to any semblance of normality, even though there's an appearance of it in some urban areas, the fact that they're facing so much resistance from the rest of the country, you can say, look, your coup failed. I mean, by now you should be inviting the Chinese back in to start all these projects. You should have the pandemic under control. You should not be bombing your own people in multiple locations around the country on a daily basis.
Has perhaps the pandemic allowed them to just keep hunkered down and not do any of these things? Because they're so isolated now with the extra pandemic. Has that affected it?
I think like a lot of authoritarian states, they're using the pandemic to justify They
Just every state. Oh my
Yeah.
God, it's shocking, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just like, look, look at all the great things that we're doing. We're giving people oxygen, and we're vaccinating these people. And we're doing all of this. They're using that kind of pandemic response to bolster their legitimacy. But a lot of people just don't buy it.
It's not working.
They destroyed the healthcare system. They destroyed the education system because so many people joined what's called the civil disobedience movement. And so a lot of healthcare workers just said, I'm not working.
Tell me about the civil disobedience movement.
Early on in February, a lot of people announced the formation of CDM, Civil Disobedience Movement, which basically means don't go to work, don't pay your electricity bill, don't pay your taxes, don't do anything that endorses the military coup, but and protest, but do it peacefully. So it's the kind of the more peaceful arm of civil resistance to this that then kind of morphed into an exiled government, a parallel government, and then some people who were CDM actually then moved into forming what are called People's Defence Forces, PDFs, of which there are now hundreds.
So many acronyms in Burma. It's a struggle to follow.
You would not think that Burma could potentially absorb so many more new acronyms. It seems to be infinite potential.
It really is.
And I think actually trying to understand all of those acronyms should actually, in my view, account for fluency in a language. That if you can have a conversation and roll off.
Well, there you go. That's your language. Yeah. So, was this widespread, the civil disobedience movement? Was it national? Was it more urban?
It was truly national. And it wasn't just an urban phenomenon. You'd see small, isolated villages and people, peacefully marching out and saying, we reject the State Administration Council, the military coup. There were very colourful early protests that included. There was one of my favourites was the bodybuilders who came out, and it's like we're bodybuilders against the coup.
Oh, I must Google that.
I think you'd like it. Maybe not like the response to that, which is the unfit men who are against the coup. And so all of these guys who are, rather portly and out of shape.
Weren't Googling that.
And protested. There were the beauty queens, the cyclists, like basically the grab drivers, because you can't have motorbikes in Yangon.
Oh, can you tell? Sorry, I find that so funny. Can you tell us about the weird motorbike thing that they have in Yangon?
So it's very strange for a Southeast Asian city, a former capital city like Rangoon, not to have millions of motorbikes everywhere. And there's several million people who live in Rangoon. But you will see them kind of in the outskirts of the city, the peri-urban areas where there's a lot. But in the main streets, it's all bicycles or it's cars. No one really knows the full reason. There are lots of different reasons. One is that a general's son apparently died in a motorbike accident, racing motorbikes, and he banned it.
That was a story I was told. Are you saying it's an urban myth?
Well, it's not been confirmed. Another one is that so many motorbikes means that the security forces will have difficulty tracking people down, that you could actually go and shoot someone and kind of disappear into all the other motorbikes. That you see.
That makes sense.
Sometimes in other cities with lots of motorbikes.
Like they don't allow stickers in the car as well, right? For the same reason that you can't. They're afraid that people have guns in the car and shoot and run.
That's one theory too. But now there's so many more. There's so many more cars in Rangoon. And even with curfews, it's very difficult.
I think these theories you're mocking were ones you told me years ago as truths.
There are multiple theories. There's no one complete total truth when you look at all of these things. There's in Burmese you would say kolahala, rumours, and it's a wonderful thing to be trading these rumours, but you shouldn't necessarily believe all of them.
Fair enough. Yeah, so, okay, let's talk about Thailand now. So right now there's a lot going on in Mae Sot, right? Tell me about the refugee crisis currently happening in Mae Sot.
Well, unfortunately what we're seeing is another in a 40-year cycle of the conflicts in Burma spilling into Thailand and Thailand having to take, to bear some of the burden of this. There was fighting in December close to the border. And again, the Burmese military used airstrikes and heavy artillery, and a lot of the civilians who were sheltering in this village were displaced, and some of them crossed into Thailand, and many of them want to go back when it's safe to go back to their homes. And then other people in different parts of the border, in Mae Hong Son province and Tak province.
How many? There are 2 permanent refugee camps.
There's 9.
There are 9 permanent refugee camps. Okay.
Except they're not called refugee camps because Thailand's not a signatory to the 1951 Refugees Convention.
Right.
So they're temporary sites for displaced persons from Burma.
How many people are we talking about? They're permanently, impermanently.
I think now it's around 100,000. There are discrepancies in the figures because you have formal figures, but then there's people who've come into the camps over the past 10, 15 years fleeing fighting, but haven't been formally registered, but still get fed.
But this current crisis now, I heard there's a new camp with 10,000, is it?
It's several thousand, yeah. It's quite a bit, and in some
who are
areas, there's a difference. There's ethnic Karen people from that area, but there's also a fair amount of people from the CDM that we were talking about, from the National Unity Government, which is the parallel anti-military government that was formed in
Who are they?
2021.
Where did they form?
They formed in parts of the country and in physical parts of the country where they were all kind of connected by Zoom. They also formed virtually for those who escaped and made it to third countries around the world. It's a virtual government that was formed basically by Zoom calls. And,
wow. And do they represent most of the ethnic groups?
Yes and no. They represent, some of them are people who were elected in November 2020.
Oh, okay.
Some of them were appointed because they're seen as very influential people. So the president, Dua Lashila, is a very well-respected Kachin leader from northern Shan State. Some of the other ministers, they weren't voted in, and their selection processes maybe not as transparent as you would like a formal government to be, but under the circumstances. And what they've then done is create this, and sorry to bombard you with another acronym, the NUCC,
the what?
The National Unity Consultative Committee, which is far more representative of different ethnic groups, and they're going to be more inclusive about getting as many different people together so that they can all agree on a broad political platform.
Is this something you're excited about? Is this something that could grow, could become influential, power, effective?
I am, as an analyst, need to be critical, and I don't want that to turn into being pessimistic. I see its weaknesses, but I see its potential strengths. And given that the military is so completely illegitimate and brutal and ruthless, anything that works against their demise is, to me, worth supporting. It doesn't mean you need to be a full paid-up member. I love Burma, but it's not my country. But anything I can do to help friends from there, I'll definitely do. It's ultimately their fight.
Yeah.
And I think we have to find ways to support what they want to do. And I think we all need to kind of step back a little bit and kind of go, this won't be a very neat, understandable, credible package. It's going to be very confusing, and there'll be different perspectives. But, to me, that really reflects the complexity of the country.
You just used all the words that I would describe Burma. Absolutely, yeah. It's just so complex. So are we talking about millions of people, thousands who are part of this sort of movement, or how large is it?
In terms of, well, they have a website, and you can go and actually look at the ministers and the deputy ministers and
oh, they actually have appointed ministers.
Oh yeah.
Oh wow.
Oh yeah. It looks like a government.
Oh wow.
And very slick website, and they're very big on social media. They're releasing statements about multiple issues on a regular basis. So they're trying to present themselves as a credible alternative government, and they're actually reaching out to governments around the world to engage with them.
Okay.
And I think increasingly a lot of governments are so frustrated with the military that they're like, you know what, let's start speaking to the National Unity Government, because they may not have power, but then neither does the military really. And
That's what I don't understand. I mean, by the sounds of it, everyone's anti them. You know, there are multiple armies that actually are equipped to fight them. How are they retaining this power? Like, how are they recruiting? How are they keeping the recruits? They're recruiting soldiers from all over the country, and lots of them are dying. How do they keep the loyalty? I mean, how are they keeping on to this?
Ultimately, it comes down to fear. When your family has been kept in a compound and you're at the front line, if you defect or you move, it's your mother that they're going to take it out on. And that's been a feature of this military for many years. Another part of the miscalculation for staging the coup, and I've heard a lot of Myanmar friends point this out to me, they're like, look at all the people in these PDFs in parts of Sagaing, the Irrawaddy Delta, who are fighting the military. They were the obvious recruits to join the military. They come from really poor rural communities. Joining the military would give them a certain status. It would, mean that their family members would get extra rice, and basically it's not great, and there's the risk of dying or being injured. But you get a certain protection by joining that institution. Now the people that would normally join are the ones fighting the military. So they're, in the future, I think, going to have a recruitment problem. I mean, who wants to join a military that offers you no protection, and in which, over the past year, we've seen hundreds, potentially even thousands. There's lots of different figures out there. But an army that's like, oh my God, we're taking casualties in like multiple parts, not like way out there in the mountains and the jungle where it's kind of forgettable and people in the cities don't get it. We're being targeted in the cities. We're being targeted on our way to the base.
Right.
And a lot of defectors who are coming to the opposition, and I've heard this from multiple people, these soldiers basically saying, if I want to leave the base, the officers won't let me leave with the rifle because they're afraid we're going to take off and join the opposition.
Okay.
Others I've heard like we're not leaving our base because we will get mauled if we do.
Well, that sounds
like basically, don't fire on us. We won't come out and shoot at you. And so, what the military is going to have to rely on increasingly is the more highly trained and incredibly ruthless troops. That whenever something bad happens in Myanmar over the years to the Rohingya Muslims or to civilians in Karen State and others, they usually use these light infantry division troops who just basically don't have any qualms about burning down houses and killing and raping people.
And who are they? Who's training them?
The military's training them. They basically have this esprit de corps whereby we're real war fighters. We go in and this is I've seen footage of someone pointing to their badges and saying with the 22nd Light Infantry Division we came here to kill. And so the snipers that we used in say Mandalay that were killing unarmed protesters on the street. It's just psychopaths that are given free rein in the military. And I think increasingly the potential to internally divide the institution, where there's people going, I hate that you staged this coup, I hate that I've lost half my friends, and I've got to deal with these psychopaths, and I don't want to kill normal people. Like, I thought we were killing the enemies of the country. The ethnic armed organizations, the rebels, but now everyone's a rebel.
So is there more understanding of because there was always a bit of the Yangon Burmans and then all the ethnicities, and there wasn't much empathy or sympathy or understanding, right? Is there beginning to be kind of, I mean, I'm feeling a bit excited by all this, like, the military's weakening, people are coming together. I mean, is there beginning to be more of an understanding between the Burmans that their plight is shared, perhaps?
Definitely. I think I saw that with some of my friends who had grown up in Rangoon, and when we travelled to conflict areas, their education was in this was like, so all those reports were right all along.
Right.
And they were like this. And a lot of younger people who are now fighting against the coup and against the military had just spent the past 10 years getting educated, going to shopping malls, phones, everything's great. Now it's like, oh, you're dragging us back to the dark ages. We don't want that.
Yeah.
But also this recognition that everything that happened to the Rohingya Muslims, true. And now it's happening to people who were accepted as being part of Myanmar. It's happening to ethnic Burmans who are resisting. And it's like you burnt 10 people alive. And so people are seeing this and going, this military was that bad all along. And for a lot of people, they didn't really want to confront that unfortunate reality, because to them, the conflicts of 70 years were way out there. They were in places that they would never go to and didn't really care. And that these were just unfortunate realities that affect other people. And now it's affecting everyone.
Right. And how's social media had a role in all of this?
It's played a very important role, both positive and negative, of course. Positive in the sense you see a lot of people using it to communicate, lots of very tech-savvy people who are both recording things, communicating, but then, of course, the negative side about spreading rumours and hate. And there's a propensity amongst some people involved in the anti-coup movement to what they call social shaming. And so it's like, I saw you talking to a soldier, therefore you're a target. Or you paid your bill.
Really?
Yeah. And so a lot of people who are like, I'm afraid to kind of, I was reading just the other day, someone who told another researcher, I went to get a COVID vaccine, but I hid it from all my friends. And, normally people are like, got my COVID vaccine, it's great. She was like, no, you could never do that. Wow. Because any connection to the military could potentially make you a target. And
how have they handled the COVID, the pandemic?
Terribly. Absolutely terribly. One of the worst in the world. In the post-coup environment, when Delta really started raging, a lot of friends of mine lost their parents because, it was really desperate days when there was no oxygen. The hospitals weren't taking COVID patients. And especially, you would know this from being in Rangoon quite a bit. It's kind of high density living.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of multi-generational families. And so it's fit young people in their 20s, but with their grandparents in their 60s. And so there was a lot of fear about infections, and even at some points there were people lined up outside hospitals just in rows on the street.
You don't really hear about that outside of Burma at all. I didn't hear about any of that.
And parts of the city when things got pretty desperate, where you would hang a bit of coloured material outside your apartment and just leave the body of your family member out there, and people would come and people in hazmat suits would come and pick it up. Oxygen bottles were just impossible to get. And then you've got the military propaganda machine saying, we're the ones kind of helping everyone. And in a system that they destroyed, they're blaming all the responses on the CDM movement.
God, it must be frustrating.
And so people were basically left to fend for themselves. That's
really. And how do they do with the vaccines?
Terribly. I mean, they're getting some. They're coming in, but again, the military is going, we vaccinated 2,000 people at this military base. Aren't we great? And it's like, maybe just vaccinate them and just keep it. And just keep better records. And so it was always going to hit hard because Burma has a terrible healthcare system.
Yeah.
And so that was always, going to be rough. But then on top of a coup, it just made things worse. And I just fear that we'll probably never know just how many people.
Really?
Yeah.
So sorry, just back to the junta a bit. I'm still fascinated by how big is this junta? Are we talking about like 5 really evil men? Are we talking about, there's this whole problem going on in this country. And how big are the people, how large is the group that's holding on to power?
It's a relatively small inner circle. And it's a military. So, if you're number one, you're number one. If you're number two, well, you only take orders from number one. And then everyone kind of fans out, and it's all very kind of wooden loyalty. I just do what I'm told. Might very well have complex thoughts of my own. But if I want to survive, then...
so it's not sort of an oligarchy of a bunch of people at the top with old family interests or anything. It's all come up through the military.
But they do have those oligarch tendencies in that all of the generals, the senior generals, most of them are pretty wealthy. And that's because their children or their wives have
Colour
been
me shocked.
It's not unlike any other military dictatorship in the world. And so they can claim that they're clean. And, you know, in Burma, if you really want to go after someone, you accuse them of corruption. And that's what the military's done to Aung San Suu Kyi. You know, all of these, they just slapped, a few days ago, they slapped 5 more charges of corrupt practices in purchasing a helicopter for the Natural Disaster Department or something. 5 charges, all of which bring her 5 years in prison. So that's an extra 25 years. 136 years, I saw one estimate of how much she's charging. And it's all like, you're corrupt, you're corrupt. Coming from a military in which generals live in mansions when their monthly salary is only a couple of thousand.
Yeah, because you mentioned just now about their wives and how they stay clean. How do they do that, the generals?
Nothing's in their name. It's all it's the offspring and the wife. And it's like, no, don't give me that. So, someone once said to me that the former president, U Thein Sein, who was the head of the Triangle Regional Command, just up here across from Mae Tao, in Chengtung, said, "Oh, he wasn't corrupt." I said, "What do you mean he wasn't corrupt?" They said, "Well, he never asked for anything. He just took what he was given." But he was really smart because he was like, "Oh, don't give me that. Give it to my wife." And so when someone turned up with a 4-wheel drive, it was like, "I'm not corrupt. Give it to my wife."
My wife owns an aircraft carrier, and
and some are definitely more corrupt than others. I mean, Min Aung Hlaing was given a huge mansion that used to be a military intelligence interrogation facility, surrounded by all of these foreigners working for international organizations. And
that's going to be awkward.
Well, looking back now, it's like, you know, you were kind of living pretty close to some pretty terrible people. Yeah. And laughing it off.
So what about Aung San? I mean, what's her standing these days? How's she seen?
She's still enormously popular with a lot of people. I mean, she won an election in which, you know, there's a lot of people who still really support her. There's a lot of other fairly progressive people who have become increasingly critical. Yeah. That over the years she became a civilian version of a military leader. She was an ethnic Burma Buddhist elite who looked down on people in a similar way to the military.
So what's your opinion?
I think she was never the Democrat that we all thought she was. She's articulated as long ago as several years ago that she wasn't a human rights activist and she wasn't a humanitarian.
Why would she say that?
Well, she said, "I've always been a politician. I've never been a human rights person. I've never been a humanitarian." If you were a good politician, you'd say, well, every politician should be a humanitarian human rights activist.
You'd think.
And you know, I like to please everyone. She just became this, she didn't build coalitions, she didn't listen to people, she didn't seek alliances, all the things that one of the first rules of politics is never make an enemy that you don't need to. And she just made enemies across the board because she was imperious, condescending. Some of the speeches that she gave when she would travel around the country, you know, she said to some women who'd been displaced by the war in Kachin, you know, you shouldn't be here accepting handouts. And I'm staying in a nice resort by the river. You should get a job there. Oh, yeah. My favorite was when she went to one of the most northern parts of Myanmar in Putao. And in her speech, she actually said, "I've noticed you ethnic people are rather short in stature. And that's because you need better nutrition. So we built this road for you so that you can develop physically and mentally to help contribute to the development of the country." Oy. It's like, wow, you just call them short and backward. Yes. And think that a road is going to solve this somehow. And when I actually mentioned that to some diplomats and other friends, they were like, "No, you're joking," to get the speech out.
Because her international image is completely opposite.
Plummeted.
Well, plummeted now.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, a terminal, I think the only thing that might redeem her international standing is that she is facing this unfair prosecution. Yeah. There is no, you can dislike what she's done, you can dislike her as a person. There is no way you can justify her imprisonment. And the charges against her are absolutely ludicrous, comically, ruthlessly ludicrous. I mean, she just got sentenced to a few years in prison the other day for unregistered walkie-talkies that they found in her house.
Oh, bless.
That was for her bodyguards, and actually.
Will she be released again? I mean, it seems to be a bit of a cycle. You know.
I mean, she's 76, I think now.
Oh, really?
Yeah. You know, if she's up to several years in the charges that they've already convicted her on and sentenced her.
Right.
And as I was saying, if they find her guilty on all of those charges, 136 years in prison. You know, she's got a lot of longevity in her, but I think that's asking a bit too much.
So you think that's it for her? Or do you think she'll come back onto the world stage anyway?
I don't, because what I think the military's done is unleash all of these new political forces, many of whom do not see her as their leader. And I've heard more than a few younger people in their 30s saying the worst thing that could happen right now is if the military releases Aung San Suu Kyi, and she would do a deal with them, and then our revolution would be betrayed.
Right.
Now that's not what everyone thinks, of course, but there's quite a few people who say that, and there are a number of people who say it's unfair what's happening to her. It's not right. However, if she'd want to control everything right now. So maybe it's good that she's not, that she's forced to sit this one out.
Yeah.
But that said, her and her party won an election.
Yeah.
There were some irregularities, but nothing at all that justified a coup or her imprisonment.
Yeah. So is there any new great hope, any young leader, any group that okay, apart from this, diaspora online Zoom, is there anything that's sort of a bit hopeful, any leader?
I think there's a lot of this current generation realise the negative aspect of Aung San Suu Kyi, and that she was built up to be this great person that no one could really live up to, and she definitely could not live up to, and that there's a young activist who in a news story a few years ago was called the next Aung San Suu Kyi. And I remember her getting furious at that, going, I don't want to be the next Aung San Suu Kyi. And a lot of people saying, we don't need any more Aung San Suu Kyi.
Yeah.
And in fact, we should be looking at multiple generational leadership changes and get rid of all of these old men that run a lot of organizations. Have a more diverse form of leadership. I think people are very wary of charismatic individuals that promise a lot and deliver nothing.
Yeah.
And we've seen that with some of the former political prisoners that were venerated for years, and then they get out of prison and you find out that they're rampaging racists.
Oh.
And also some of them kind of intellectually clueless, and just expect all of this veneration because they spent a lot of time in prison. Not all of them, but definitely some of them. So I think this movement is really trying to eschew charismatic authority and to bring about the downfall of the military, but not put it all on the shoulders of one individual.
Sounds pretty sensible. So how are we looking for the next few years? Do you have any general vague predictions or anything that you think might be happening?
I unfortunately can't see it ending well, and I can't see any end.
Gosh, it's been so long, hasn't it? It just keeps going.
It's been so long, and
how they live like that?
It's almost as if the military said, "Oh, you were heading off to a bright future that you could see. Forget it. You're coming back with us." And yet, I think there are a lot of things to be hopeful for. There are a lot of people who are really dedicated. They know who the enemy is now, and they know that there's no progress until the military goes, and who don't want to compromise on that point, but will hopefully be willing to compromise on lots of other things, that have seen the error of the consequences of majority rule over minorities. And as a good friend of mine, has said repeatedly over the years, people kind of look at Myanmar and they go, "Oh, it's got a minority problem. There's all these diverse minorities." And she always says, "No, they've got a majority problem."
Oh, I like that.
The majority has to see their behaviour in the context of how they look down on people.
Yeah.
And she's spot on. And I think that's the way people should be looking at it, is that the problem is Burman chauvinism that looks down on other people. And hopefully that is being challenged now, that there's more of a generation of people going, actually, it's that kind of part of our personality, the way that we perceive others, that led to the military, that infuses the National League for Democracy, Aung San Suu Kyi's party, that actually we should be changing our political culture and not trying to be subservient to an identity in which everyone in that country has multiple ethnic identity. There's no pure race. It's
common
completely
sense.
ridiculous. Unfortunately, people don't see it that way.
No.
It's like, your ethnicity, you can belong, but at a subordinate level, and mine is the best. And if you've told someone they're number 2, then they're going to want to find a number 3 that they can look down on.
Yeah.
And it's a perfect operating system for an authoritarian regime. Divide and rule, hierarchies, and make people desperate and fight over the trickle-down spoils. And that was how they held on to power for many, many years. And unfortunately, I don't think that they've got the intelligence to think of anything differently. And so they're just pulling out all of these old tools of repression and going, works every time, let's do it again. And
Works?
It's been a slogan that you hear a lot of younger people say in the aftermath of the coup, that you've messed with the wrong generation. And I think that the military, I think there's this dawning realization that maybe those old tools of repression won't work with this generation, because they've glimpsed all the freedoms that their parents didn't have. And even their parents don't want to go back to those dark ages.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of sentiment that you've messed with the wrong generation means that you're going to have multiple forms of resistance. You have what all the media would like to see, young people in the jungle with weapons, but you'll have people who go back to work and then throw a spanner in the operations of things.
Don't pay their electricity bills.
Don't pay their electricity bills, or there's multiple ways that people are going to be innovative in how they maintain this struggle. And almost every day you see 10, 15 younger people just race through a street, in a flash mob, and then just disappear. And there's people who are just choosing not to cooperate with the military system, but don't want to be violent. And then others who are like, look, I'm no good with a gun, I'm no good with this or that, but I'm a good artist, and that's what I want to do. And so I think it's a generation that has been made more extreme, but will hopefully see that that tolerance of different ways of resisting is the best way forward, because they viscerally see that the military is just waiting to pit them all against each other, and then just sit on top of it all and just watch them fight it out. And I think this is a generation that's not going to be duped like that again.
God, you've got me oscillating between rah-rah hopeful and then just bleak depression. I'm not entirely sure where I'm going to get what I'm thinking with all this.
I think you start with the bleak depression when you look at the situation, and then look for the hopeful elements. I mean, I don't think people should be kind of going, it's a lost cause, let's walk away. Yeah. People of Burma deserve so much better than that. And they're realizing, I've got a lot of friends who are studying overseas now, and feeling guilty that they're walking away from this for a year or two. And I'm like, this is going to go on. Like, go and get your master's degree. Go on, take a rest. This is a lot of people who were exhausted by what they did.
I can say the same to you. You've been at it for 25 years.
Yeah, and I'll be at it for for the foreseeable future, because I believe in it. And I think these people, everyone in the country, everyone deserves a lot better than they're getting. And any way that people in the outside world can find ways to help, even in very small ways. I mean, even trying to understand the situation.
Yeah, that's what we're hopefully trying to do here. And also donate. There's lots of ways to donate to various causes.
There's great organisations to donate to. Do not donate to the United Nations. Whatever you do, don't donate to the United Nations. There's lots of different groups that Pim can put you in touch with, where the aid actually goes.
We'll write it all up at the end.
Write it all up. And support people, that the money will actually get to people in need, and there's lots of people in need. Excellent.
Dave, that was really, really interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
And I think we can continue this over a tipple or two.
A libation.
There we go.
I think
Thank
we deserve it.
you.
Thank you
Bye,
very much, Ben.
everyone.
Bye-bye.